Well, first off, Merry Christmas, everybody. I can't tell you, seriously, about how much, honestly, I mean this from my soul. This is one of the most memorable nights of my entire life. It makes me very proud to talk about Sacramento. We are the genesis of the American Industrial Revolution that made the United States what it is today, and it started right here in Sacramento. I have, since I was very young, had a passion for Abraham Lincoln. And I've also had a chip on my shoulder about Sacramento's history. And so tonight, I get to try and tie all this together in a way that I think will make everybody understand what an astonishingly unique, global, dynamic city Sacramento is and has been, that nobody in the East has a clue about. And not too many people in Sacramento, by the way. So we're working on that with the Sacramento Historical Society right now. Here's Abraham Lincoln. And don't you love this Yosemite picture? This is here because we are the luckiest. This is what makes this Christmas so special to me. We are the luckiest people on the planet. I really believe that. I mean, everybody that lives in this town, and in California in particular, but in Sacramento, where 80% of the water in the state of California comes from north of Sacramento. Don't ever forget that, okay? And we live with it every day, right? We make the Mississippi River look like chump change when it's raining around here. And that's no joke, okay? Because the volume of water coming down the Sacramento River, 70 miles from the crest, is a long ways from the headwaters in Montana, 2,000 miles from New Orleans, okay? So we are the most flood-prone city in America. I mean, make New Orleans really look like it's no problem compared to what we face around here. This climate thing is 1.6% of the people in the world live in this kind of a climate, right? So how blessed are we to have the weather that we have around here year-round? Sometimes a little more water than we like, sometimes a little hotter than we like, but man, are we living the dream when it comes to weather. And only 1.6, and it's, where's the other places? Italy, Portugal, France, places that are world-class cities on another part of the planet. And interesting stratus here because it's also on the west side of Chile, west side of Australia, west side of Africa down there. This is a slide I put up for years, but it's really who we are, the gold rush, the railroad, the Swamplands Act, and the electricity, right? And so here we are from the electricity in 1895, and we are all the state capital of by far the most powerful state in the Union and the fifth largest economy in the world. This is from Emma Lazarus, and this is what partly this talk is about Sacramento and liberty, and how Sacramento is at the root of liberty in the nation, more so than any other state by 10 miles, and nobody's even close, in my opinion. This phrase, the Golden Door, is actually written on Emma Lazarus's poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty in a plaque, and that is the plaque, and that is the phrase on the Statue of Liberty. And guess who the Golden Door is, in case you're confused? That would be us, right? That would be Sacramento, the place where the gold was found, which was a hugely important factor in the economic development of this country and was at the root of the Second Industrial Revolution. And so, Main Street, this electrical light came from Walt Disney's seeing what we did in 1895 in Sacramento. And he actually, I've read this in several Disney books, that the idea of him having a Main Street electrical light parade came from Sacramento on the evening of 9/9/1895, and that's a fact, okay? Now we're off to the second phase of this conversation. So this is what the claims were. This is so interesting and so fascinating because this to me is all about watersheds in this country and how they have worked over historically, right? So here you have the British at the Appalachians, and then the French with Louisiana at the time, and then Spain, right? And so that went quickly to, there's the Appalachians, which was the line for the Indians from King George III saying, you can't go west of these Appalachians, it's Indian territory, stay out of it, behave yourselves, because also the French happened to be on this other side, and they were trying not to get into a war. They got into one anyway. French and Indian War is what caused the American Revolution. This is the American Revolution. 8-year battle, 1775 to 1783. George Washington was right in the middle of this thing at the beginning and even before the beginning, because he had actually served with the British and went all the way over to the Ohio River in 1754-55, believe it or not. And do you see this little line on the far left up there, up in the corner? That's George Rogers Clark, who actually went over there with a bunch of volunteers and from Vincennes, Indiana, took out and beat the British in Detroit And he single-handedly is the reason Benjamin Franklin got us everything to the Mississippi River because of that one battle he fought in 1780, and that's no joke. So I wanted to show you what this Ohio River arrangement looked like because it's the southern border of 3 states. Obviously, the Ohio River and then Illinois are central to Abraham Lincoln's life in particular. So here we go. We finally get to the end of the Revolutionary War, and here's the Treaty of Paris. And so we get all the land complements that Ben Franklin's negotiating all the way to the Mississippi River. So we went from, if you go back to the Appalachians, right, clear on the East Coast, all of a sudden we're like 7 times the size of what we were just like that with a snap of the fingers. And because George had been over all the way to the Ohio River and wanted it to connect the Ohio to the Mississippi and increase trade that way, he was a major trade guy and had a huge manufacturing operation running on his own farm at Mount Vernon. So and he manufactured all kinds of things, including beer and distilled liquor and grow every kind of crop and so forth. I mean, it was incredible what he did. And he had several water wheels, just like Sutter, right? Several water wheels, and used those water wheels to harness his barns and turn them into almost like electricity. It was incredible how dynamic that was in the 1700s. And then along comes the Constitution, right? And so we make that fatal mistake of encompassing slavery at a time in the world when it was pretty much going in the opposite direction, and this country decided to accept it as a condition to create a constitution, right? And it was kind of an unfortunate bargain, kind of the original sin of the United States, and we're still carrying the burden of that today, in my opinion. So this is my map that gives you kind of an interesting correlation of the watershed. Go from the Appalachians to the Rocky Mountains and see that all that watershed, basically, for the most part, is coming down the Mississippi River, one way or the other, through the Arkansas, which is a little below that, and other rivers. It all ends up in the Mississippi. That's one segment. And of course, on the other side, we have the Sierras, right? That's us. And if you look at the latitude of Sacramento and Washington, D.C., ironically enough, pretty astonishing that we're both at 38 degrees, right, latitude. And the fact that, you know, here we are in the Sacramento River and they're over there on the Potomac. And it's just so ironic that we go from one coast to the other transcontinentally and end up in a situation like that. That little corner up there of the Columbia River, that is got its own story about Sacramento and California. And the Missouri River, of course, is the headwaters of the Mississippi. This guy, Robert Gregg, went up to Columbia on May 11, 1792, put a stake in the ground, sent it back to Thomas Jefferson, and lo and behold, we are now sort of a quasi-colony laying a claim to the west coast of the United States, all the way from Washington, D.C. in George Washington's first term. Think about that, George Washington's first term. Allah, he comes home, turns in his papers. Jefferson sees it's an opportunity to connect the Missouri River to the Columbia River and takes off with Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark go out there, they make it all the way to what was basically Astoria today and end up putting a stake in the ground overland, right? So now we have 2 claims to that land at a point when, as it turned out, Russia was there, Spain was there, France, and Britain. And the only people that got out there and put a stake in the ground was little old United States of America when we were very, very young, and that's a fact. And that is where the northern border of California came from, as you're about to see, okay? So this is what it looked like after that. We have the area that the French owned, called Louisiana, and then New California, which is owned by the Spanish, and then under that disputed territory up there in the corner, which nobody had any control of, right? And this is what it became, the Missouri Territory, and then the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which included us, and then Oregon Country, which is the Northwest at the time, okay? And what do you have on this map at the southern border of that stake in the ground in 1792? California. There's 2 lines in this map that are absolutely astonishing. The one coming from the northern border of California that ultimately extended all the way to the Rockies. What you're about to see was the original California, right? All the way to the Rockies. And at the 3630 there, between Tennessee and Kentucky, Missouri and Arkansas forth, that was the slavery line. That came eventually, as you'll see, all the way to California. So this is what it looked like in 1820, the Missouri Compromise. And we ended up with this. That was the moment when Henry Clay, which was a big idol of Abraham Lincoln's, came up with the idea, okay, let's just compromise and kick the can down the road, because the Constitution said that no more slavery trading after 1808, they couldn't end it before 1808, and they were never able to end it after 1808, which is what led to this continuing battle, right? This is the first attempt to resolve that, and it ended up in a stalemate, 1 free state, 1 slave state. That went on for the next 30 years, okay, and it was 1515 by the time we got to 1850. So this is what it looked like. And this is the Treaty of 1819, and the Spanish treaty line that goes all the way to the Rockies, right? What's interesting about this is when Louisiana became a state, the way they were admitted, they were the first country, first state, I mean, admitted into the United States that wasn't part of the original states without being a territory first, okay? That only happened one more time. Guess what that was? That was us, okay? And there was a reason for it, and it was slavery. So here's what we look like in that evolution, right? And so this is still the Spanish, the Missouri Territory, and the Oregon Country, right? Now we're in all the way up to 1920, and then we move forward, and this is where we switch into us, right? Sacramerica, this is my vision and reality of what Sacramento actually is in this world. And George Hirsch is my best quote on this. Hirsch stated, the greatest economic event in the history of the United States at that point in time was the gold rush because of what it did to the United States, because it tripled the size, because it accelerated the economic incentive of everybody. And so if you think about a country that was modeled after Wealth of Nations, that was about trade, predominantly trade, right? The reality of it is that the gold rush created this national dynamo, and so people started coming in, and of course the world rushed in, right? Accelerated scientific advancement out here because it was a long ways east, and that created that Argonaut spirit to come out here and start from scratch and not be afraid to do that. This really ties into Abraham Lincoln, by the way, in a way you'll see in a minute. If you think about the reality of this country at the time, we were the 31st state, right? What happened is when they tried to admit California, there was a huge war that broke out in Congress, right? Free your slave. And of course, James Polk, who was from the South and supported the South, actually started that war to facilitate the expansion of slavery. And the reality of it was that California comes in, and what does California do? We have our little constitutional convention in 1849, right in the middle of the gold rush, right in the heat of the gold rush, right? And what happened is, at the end of 1848, about the time Polk made the announcement about this gold being on the streets of Sacramento, the conclusion that Zachary Taylor would come to, who, by the way, was from Mississippi, the 12th president, owned slaves, who was all in for ending slavery, believe it or not, ironically enough. And so he instructed Major General Bennett Riley, the 7th governor of California, he instructed him to create a constitution to bring to Washington, D.C. The military created the Constitution that came to Washington, D.C. And his Secretary of State, if you will, if you want to call it that, because it literally wasn't a state at the time, was Henry Halleck, right? Who ended up becoming Abraham Lincoln's chief of staff as the general in the Civil War. But he actually was out here, and he's the guy that took the minutes and created the Constitutional Convention, lasted 37 days, and oddly enough, Sacramento voted itself into the Union at the creation of that Constitution as a free state. The first state, at that time, the only state in the United States that was admitted into this Union with no slavery baggage, no slavery history, no connections to the slave burden of the South and the whole manner in which that was conducted, which was a huge moment. That's the constitutional liberty I'm referring to. And the first thing that happened out here, because of that whole thing I talked about, science, the rail yards, which were kind of the hotbed of scientific advancement in the West at the time, led to the development of all these universities. Think about this. There's probably 30 people in Sacramento in 1848 at New Helvetia. The gold gets struck. 20 years later, they're putting a stake in the ground in Berkeley for the first University of California. That quick. Isn't that unbelievable to think about? So this is my, this is actually from, the genesis of this concept right here comes from a guy by the name of John Winthrop, who in 1612, first Massachusetts Bay Colony governor, used the phrase, a shining city upon a hill. You guys ever heard that phrase? Okay, so who's the next guy that used that very same phrase? Ronald Reagan. Tell me that doesn't look like Disneyland and Cinderella's castle on the top of the hill, right? So there you have it right there. And it's a beautiful image, and I especially like that the light on top, which to me symbolizes the Enlightenment, okay? Which is why I put that in there, because that is who we are. That's who Sacramento is, in my opinion. And that's what we're able to bring in our little dynamic I'm going to share with you in a minute about who we are and how that has evolved. And so the first guy I want to bring attention to that was so involved with this, that they put this place on the map, who was a genius. The guy was an absolute national genius. And his name was Theodore Judah. And he actually he came from New York. The governor of New York recommended him to this famous guy in San Francisco that was a big guy that wanted to start the railroad out here, right? So Theodore Judah comes out here, and he's got a train going over here before the East ever managed to even attempt to build a bridge over the Mississippi River. Think about that. So in 1855, with this little Sacramento Valley Railroad, right, going from 3rd and R to Folsom, what do they go there for? The gold, right? The gold, Mormon Island. That's what propelled the train coming, 3,000 miles away and starting out going east. And so here comes Theodore Judah with a dream to do just that, right? And he builds this little bridge about the same time that we were about to segue into Abraham Lincoln, right? And this all parallels, which is ironically enough in a very kind of a cool way. So Abraham Lincoln did these 12 things, the 12 acts of Lincoln, I call it. Actually, I learned another one in the last 3 days. So this is the Rock Island Bridge. This bridge was built in 1857. And you can see that it was the first bridge across the Mississippi River. And ironically enough, and this is kind of what it looked like, this is the actual picture of the bridge. You can tell by the quality of the picture that it's a real picture, right? Not very good. But it gets the point across how this bridge was built. And it was pretty amazing at the time to have something like that built, first one across the Mississippi. And so what happens 2 weeks in? You remember the bridge crash that we just had in Maryland? That's exactly what happened in 1857 with this bridge. And this isn't the exact picture of the results, but that's about what it left, okay? There was the center span of that whole thing came down because a boat ran into the pier, and the boat burned and sank, and it damaged the bridge, and it stopped the train the train couldn't run, and of course the boat sank, and so a big lawsuit broke out. And who gets in the middle of that lawsuit? The famous railroad attorney of the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln, right? And so that's a very famous case. Probably Lincoln's most famous legal case in his life. But he was a very renowned orator at the time and had a hell of a reputation. This is a year before he took off with Stephen Douglas in those famous debates that actually made him the president, to be honest with you. But I can tell you that Abraham Lincoln, he was as poor as dirt. His dad was even poorer than that. So, so poor that they literally had to get up and hunt for food every day of their lives. They had nothing like we live. We live such a high quality of life. It's inconceivable how blessed we are any place in the United States, let alone being at the pinnacle of it right here in Sacramento. So the Homestead Act, and I'll tell you why this is personal. So this is the Homestead Act Visitor Center right here. And if that's the craziest looking thing you've ever seen, it's designed as a plow head that goes into the ground. The plowshare is what it's called, a plowshare, right? With that heavy point, and that's how the entire 18th century was in the 19th century, a good chunk of it was plowed with that type of a device, the plow. And that is the plow right there. And so this is actual pictures taken of people that were homesteading under the Homestead Act to come across and get 160 acres of land for free if they lived on it for 5 years and took houses with it. And I will tell you on a personal basis what happened to me, because I do these parks. This is about the way Abraham Lincoln lived. He plowed land, he built fences, he did all this kind of a thing. So as I'm wandering around, and I've done about 330 of the 420 or so national park sites and monuments all over the United States, and I love it. I have a passion for that, along with Abraham Lincoln. And so I go into this place, and I end up talking to the people that are running that place, and I said, my mother's father got a homestead, and my father's mother got a homestead. And these people that were there said, oh, do you know the name? Do you know the county? Do you know this? Do you know that? I answered all these questions. Lo and behold, the woman sits down at a computer, and she produces my grandparents' Homestead Act, signed by William Howard Taft, right there on the spot, and hands them to me. Isn't that unbelievable? And so that was one of those other moments in my life that I had tears in my eyes, with these people at the visitor center literally produced these things for me and handed them to me, and there was my grandfather's name and my grandmother's name on these things when they, in the Williston, North Dakota, Williams County, North Dakota, from the early 1900s. So here comes the train, right? Good old Theodore Judah heading east now on that train's the Jupiter. And remember, they're heading east we're talking about, heading east, right? So this is just before Promontory Point. And of course, that's the pinnacle of it. I can tell you that there's a plaque at Council Bluffs, Iowa, and it says on it that the termination of the Union Pacific Railroad is right there at Council Bluffs, which is, of course, Omaha, Nebraska, right? And I love the fact that they use termination because Union Pacific would never admit in a million years that the train came from Sacramento. That's a fact, okay? But that is a fact, too, that the train came from Sacramento. It was originated here by Theodore Judah, and it was originated originally because of the gold, and it ties together. Moving on to the Transcontinental Telegraph, okay? So everything's got Sacramento on the end of it, in case you don't see, you know. So we're in the middle of this entire transnational dynamic that's unfolding, whether it's, immigration, transportation, and communication so far, right? Here comes the moral, which is education. Here comes education on steroids, right? And what do we get with that? We get Berkeley. We got UC Davis, right? And we have the monies to build Sac City, Sac State, and so forth. All of these systems were developed complements of direct or indirect investment by the federal government through the Community College Land Grant Act. And so that is one of the reasons we are the largest educational system in the world. California is today. Then we have the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a famous painting by Francis Carpenter from 1863 of that moment when that actually happened. And that was the moment when Lincoln freed the slaves in the South, but not in the North, right? And so that moves on to the National Currency Act, the first greenbacks, right? They don't make those $10,000 bills anymore, I can tell you. But isn't that astonishing to think that Abraham Lincoln was the guy who created the greenbacks? And and the reason for this, by the way, just so you know, this war was expensive and there was no common currency. There was no common banking system. So here comes the National Bank Act, that's Samuel Chase, who was very famous. Then the first National Park Act in the history of the United States and the world. First in the world. Think about that. And you can say, actually, as the government does, it really wasn't Yosemite, it was Yellowstone. But the fact is that the whole concept, the idea, and the ideology behind it was 1,000% Abraham Lincoln, right? And how could you not love Yosemite? How blessed are we to have Yosemite 100 miles from us, really? Think about it, how blessed we are. So then comes the 13th Amendment, which was of course, Steven Spielberg's movie in 2012 about Lincoln, and that was the whole title of it, right? And that was one of the most dynamic moments in history. And guess who was right in the middle of that whole thing? Little old California. And why? Because of the number of votes and that magic calculator that Abraham Lincoln had in his head all the time about how many votes it's going to take to amend the Constitution, because he wanted to amend the Constitution, which had never been done since the original 12 amendments by Madison. And so, and that took a lot of guts at the time, but he did it at the right moment because the Civil War created the opportunity to actually face the problem and deal with it, right? So he had started it, and here's how he finished it, right? He won that thing by 2 votes in the House, and that was what the movie was about, that magic moment when they pulled together enough votes to get a 3/4 vote of the House to terminate slavery. And how many votes do you think California cast in that thing? 3. No victory without California. And he also brought in, along the way, in the Civil War, or just before the Civil War, Oregon, 1 vote, Nevada, 1 vote, and he had West Virginia in the middle of that too. So he had a little bit of wiggle room, which was good planning on his part, but without California, no liberty, right? No end of slavery. So then comes the penultimate act, the 11th thing that he did. He, right through good old Tower Bridge at the time, basically, or the I Street Bridge, the Trans-Pacific Steamship, Pacific Mail Steamship Line it was called, but it was a mail subsidy for $500,000. And this was the origination of the cruise ship business, and I'm not joking, okay? So they built, at that time, the time this was passed, which is February 15th, 1865, And January 1st of 1867, they built the four largest cargo and passenger steamships on the planet. Nobody even close. They each sat on the ship, over 1,000 people. In 1867, think about that, to go to Hong Kong. And that would have been the ultimate, accomplish the ultimate goal, which is kind of symbolized by this, right? Where they finally stopped having to go around Cape Horn. They finally didn't have Panama at the time, right? So basically what happened is all the trading started going through the United States like a bat out of hell, with the train in particular. Not just that train, but then the northern train across Canada and the southern train across the southern border of the United States. And lastly, he wins the Civil War. This is him walking in Richmond on April 9th, 1865, 6 days before he was killed. And he was mobbed by mostly black people, honestly, down there. And the stories don't show it quite as dense as this. There wasn't all that many people running around because it was kind of a dreary time and the whole damn town was on fire, to be honest with you. But it gets to the point that Abraham Lincoln went down to Richmond and savored the victory. And he did sit down in Jefferson Davis's chair and savored that victory for the remaining 6 days of his life. And then last but not least, I'm done.